What's up, everyone? Coach Tony back on the water. It's a much more preferable day than the last time I was out here. Last time it was bluebird skies, beautiful weather, but not great fishing weather necessarily. Today we got a little bit more overcast. Just had a bunch of rain. The rain just stopped, so now the water's like glass. This is my favorite way to fish. And last time I caught a fish as soon as I turned the camera off, so hopefully we get one for you today. Today I wanted to talk about specificity, and this is a concept that in powerlifting and strength training in general, I think gets a little misunderstood. And I think what a lot of people generally assume is that you have to be ultra specific in your training as far as training the barbell lifts. And I'm talking mostly as a power lifter here, so that you've got to train your competition style squat, bench press, and deadlift exactly as you perform in competition all the time if you want to get good at them. And I think this is a big time misnomer, and I think it holds a lot of people back in both a exercise selection standpoint and in a loading standpoint. And I'll talk about some of the more common ways that specificity gets interpreted and why probably the middle ground is the best way to go about your training to be well-rounded as a power lifter. Big surprise, the answer rarely lies at the extremes, but more often lies somewhere in the middle. So I think where you see a lot of people, the way that you see a lot of people, especially over recent years, train highly specific is in that they're performing the squat, bench, and deadlift exactly as they would in competition all the time, very frequently throughout the week, 2, 3, 4 times a week, depending on the lift. But for that reason, because they're performing it so often, the intensity is rarely all that high. Maybe they're doing a lot of singles in like the 5 or 6 RPE range. And to me, what I usually communicate to my lifters is that if something's a 5 or a 6, like that's still a warm-up weight. To consider something a working weight, it's got to be usually like a 7 RPE or higher. So that's great. You're training your competition lift all the time. You're definitely, greasing the groove and getting mechanically efficient at it, but you miss the specificity standpoint as far as loading goes. So specificity doesn't just go for exercise selection, but it goes for loading too. If you want to be a power lifter, the most specific load that you can do is your 1 rep max. But we kind of know that, maxing out all the time is probably not a great way to train. That's testing your strength. That's not building your strength. So where a style of training where I think gets highly specific as far as the loading protocol is more of like a conjugate style training, what some people would refer to as West Side, which is not factually correct. But I think more people are more familiar with what West Side Barbell does, and what they do is a type of conjugate training. And with conjugate style training, you work up to a max effort set, which is by definition a 1 rep max on a squat or deadlift variation and a bench variation once a week. So you have an upper body max effort day and a lower body max effort day. And what conjugate style training requires is constant switching of those max effort exercises. So they tend to use a lot of accommodating resistance, bands and chains, a lot of specialty bars. So for the squat, maybe safety bar, cambered bar. For the bench, maybe doing a lot of 3-board bench, or any board press or floor press or stuff like that. A lot of alterations to the range of motion. So that kind of fails the specificity test as far as exercise selection, but it is much more specific to the loading protocol. So I think somewhere in between that highly specific exercise selection but non-specific loading, and very specific loading but non-specific exercise selection, like maybe there's a middle ground there, and maybe there's something that we can do where we're keeping the competition style lifts in at a relatively high intensity, 1 to 3 reps in the 7 to 10 RPE range, depending on when it is. So we're always practicing those competition lifts to some degree, but then a lot of supplementary lifts, a lot of lifts done with subtle variations, maybe changes in stance, changes in grip width, changes in range of motion, maybe using bands, maybe using chains, but done in a supplementary fashion. So either, a lot of times we prescribe those after the main lift, but I think something that's helped us a lot as far as my power lifters is doing a lot more what we call working warm-ups, where we actually put the supplementary lifts first and warm up with, say, like a front squat or a high bar squat, before we do our competition style low bar squatting, something like that. I think that's a great way to get your variety in while still being pretty specific. And when I said earlier that I think a lot of people miss the boat as far as how specific you need to be, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think I would have told you, specificity is king. That's the most important thing that you can do as a powerlifter, is train your competition style lifts. I don't really believe that anymore, because once I opened my mind to experimenting with more variation with my lifters of all levels, I saw people improving their technique a lot more readily and kind of self-discovering the technique that was best for them, instead of me kind of spoon feeding it to them all the time. And I think you'll still hear a lot of high-level coaches say that beginners need more specificity than anybody because they're unskilled in the lifts, so they just got to practice. But if you're unskilled in a movement, I think that you need a lot more broad sense of what a movement is to develop that movement skill. And I think we see this in motor skill development research all the time, more specifically for sport-specific skills like running and throwing and pitching and stuff like that. But I think it goes for powerlifting as well. So if you take a beginner who wants to powerlift, you say, okay, you're only gonna back squat for now until I decide you're not a beginner anymore. Well, what happens if they're no good at back squatting, and what you recommend to them as far as stance width, as far as bar placement, as far as depth, what if it's not right for them? What if what you as the coach assume is kind of the optimal ends up not being the right choice for them? So they're just gonna spend now until whenever practicing suboptimal technique, potentially round hole square peg kind of situation. Whereas I think if you give people a lot of variety and you ask a beginner to do some goblet squatting and do some safety bar squatting and do some high bar squatting and some low bar squatting and some narrow stance and wide stance squatting, some Zercher squatting, just all kinds of different squats, and let them dig a really, really deep well, if you will, of movement skill, and help them understand that a squat is a squat is a squat. And there are a couple things that you want to do no matter what kind of squat you're doing, but then after that, it becomes individual to the lifter, whatever feels best to them. I have a feeling that they're probably going to self-discover the technique that's best for them, and that whether they're doing their competition style squat or a different kind of squat, they're probably going to be successful. I just don't think that you have to hammer the competition style lifts as often as you think you do. And I think that word's important there. Often, I think specificity and frequency often get confused, those two terms. And I find myself training my lifters with a lot of frequency for all the lifts, usually 2 or 3 times a week squatting, 2 times a week deadlifting, 2 to 4 times a week bench pressing, but it is a lot of variety. So maybe they're doing their competition style movement once or twice out of those training sessions, but those other training sessions, they're gonna do a lot of different variations. So like I said, a squat's a squat's a squat, a bench is a bench is a bench, a deadlift's a deadlift's a deadlift. And if you kind of broaden their overall sense of what that movement should be, they don't get so stuck in just thinking that there's only one way to do things, And if there's one resounding message that I feel like I keep trying to iterate to anyone who will listen, is that technique changes over time. Powerlifting's a tinkering sport, and you have to be open-minded to making changes. And you can never discover different techniques that might work better for you if you never experiment. If you're so goddamn specific all the time that you're not willing to change, and you get pigeonholed into like, okay, this is how I squat, this is how I bench, or even worse, not just how I squat and bench, or this is how everyone should do it. And I think those are the worst coaches of all, the ones who get so dead set in their ways and thinking there's only one way to do things, especially from a technique standpoint. So if you're somebody who's been struggling and having a hard time making progress with your strength, maybe open your mind to doing a little bit more variety in your training and trying different types of squats, benches, and deadlifts. They can be subtle changes. They can be small changes in just the bar placement or your grip width or something like that. They could be big swooping changes. They could be changing the bar entirely. They could be doing maybe a lot of tempo stuff. Just make sure that every once in a while, and in the case of our lifters, we usually do it once a week, at least once a week, I should say, is revisiting that competition style lift in a relatively low rep range with a relatively high RPE to make sure that whatever it is you're doing for your supplementary lifts is having some carryover. I talked about this a lot last week with kind of checking to make sure that the supplementary lifts were improving your main lift, because if you just never check in, if you only test your heavy singles, you know, at a meet, or if you only check them, you know, a couple times a year, you're not able to objectively say if what you're doing is having any sort of carryover. So don't get too caught up in specificity. You don't have to be as specific as you think. You want to develop broad movement skills and then zero that skill down into the competition lift when the time is right. All right, so I hope that helps with your training. Get that idea of specificity out of your head and turn it around and become a more well-rounded lifter.